Good evening and welcome. My name is David Bogan. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Liberal Arts and Interdisciplinary Studies here at Emerson. And it's my privilege to welcome all of you to this evening's lecture and discussion with Professor Noam Chomsky. This event is sponsored by the City in Transition Initiative, which is made possible through the support of the department chairs, the school deans, and the office of the Vice President of Academic Affairs at Emerson College. The City in Transition is a 3-year initiative begun in the fall of 2002. In the past year, the City in Transition has partnered with departments, student groups, and faculty from across the college to host over 25 different events and projects, ranging from readings by writers such as Gish Jen and Robert Creeley, to performances by local blues and jazz musicians, to service and civic engagement projects such as Underground Talent by Boston's Homeless and the H Project, to residencies and lectures by performance artists and activists such as Will Baker and Michael Keck. At its most general, the purpose of these various projects and activities is to provide, and importantly to sustain, an orientation on the part of the college to the larger urban reality, the communities, institutions, politics, and the built landscape within which Emerson, as an urban institution, is profoundly situated. More, the purpose of the City in Transition Initiative is to foster modes of communication and intellectual and creative interests, patterns of cultural and political practice, and habits of institutional behavior that point beyond the classroom and the common, and reciprocally, that bring the cultural, academic, and political life of the city more fully into our curriculum and our day-to-day lives at the college. We are engaged then in a sort of ongoing project of translation, a project aimed at bridging the various gaps between our own, admittedly somewhat unique, institutional culture and the manifold of cultures, communities, and ways of thinking and being that comprise the human geography of the contemporary city. And this project is not without its substantial challenges. Some of them are practical, like trying to find rooms or making sure that everyone is seated and well fed. Others are more philosophical or political in nature and have to do with the difficulties of bringing people together to address topics around which they may not agree, around which they may, in fact, hold positions in diametric opposition to one another. This, too, is part of the project of translation. As humans, we long for a world that is suffused with meaning, and even though it has lately become unfashionable to say so, with truth. What happens then when the basic truths on which we were all this time relying are brought into question or are confronted by other opposed or competing truths? These are certainly grounds for conflict and controversy, but they're also grounds for the recognition of difference and thus for the beginning of discussion and debate. The city, as a cosmopolitan and political space, represents the archetypical site for this sort of discussion and debate, a place of open public dispute or give and take aimed ultimately, resolutely, at the problem of truth. In short, and at its best, the city is a place where controversy is at home, and where the very fact that we're able to have this discussion in an attitude of openness and mutual respect is at times more significant than obtaining final answers. It's in this spirit of open and civil debate that I welcome all of you to tonight's lecture and discussion. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Nigel Gibson, Director of the Honors Program, who will be introducing this evening's speaker. Thank you.
Before introducing the speaker, I want to say a few words about the format of tonight's event. Because we're limited by time and want to encourage as much dialogue as possible, as well as to allow Professor Chomsky to speak, I suggest that we divide the evening in half, with a lecture in the first half and questions in the second. Those of you who want to ask questions should line up at the microphones at the front here at the end of the lecture. There comes a time when silence is dishonesty, wrote Frantz Fanon in 1956. That is what we in PRISM, the faculty group Perspectives on Race, Identity, Sexuality, Multiculturalism, felt last spring as we organized a teach-in entitled Rights and Responsibilities of Citizenship in Times of Crisis, just before the shock and awe of the US and British bombardment of Iraq. The focus of that teach-in was civic duty in the context of homeland security and the Patriot Act, and the importance of a careful, rigorous political analysis of the Middle East. Today's speaker, Noam Chomsky, could not be at that forum, but he promised to come in the fall. Thus, it could be said, in response to the Bush administration's permanent war, we are continuing that teaching. The outcomes of the war in Iraq are sadly and frighteningly even worse than what was predicted in the spring by such critics as Noam Chomsky, Robert Fisk, and Edward Said. We are faced with an unelected president who fights the terrorism of desperation with exponential terror, who in the name of freedom and security is determined to limit and undermine the freedom and security of much of the world, including Americans, especially those critical of his regime. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which are now supposedly ended, continue under other names. In Iraq, the number of American soldiers killed now outnumber those killed during the official war. While Iraqi demonstrators are shot and suspected insurgents are bombed from a distance, Iraq remains debilitated by 10 years of UN sanctions. In other words, though President Bush is currently painting a Panglossian picture, that is, this is the best of all possible worlds, that increasing US, Italian, and British casualties are the result of success, it is an increasingly threadbare rhetoric. The weapons of mass destruction that fueled the political justification for war have not been found. The building of democratic institutions that fueled the moral imperatives for war as much as they could be built by an occupying army or even by writing a constitution will no longer even be attempted. The transition, as quickly as possible, will be to an amalgam of opportunists, both old and new, including parts of the old Ba'athist military. While French Orientalists argue that the problem with the Bush administration and its Pentagon think tanks is that they don't understand the Arab, both agree that Arab culture is impervious to modern democracy. Yet despite what you read in the press and see on TV, and we never hear the voices of real people living in the Middle East, and in opposition to the wishes of the region's ruling classes, there is in fact a diverse array of opinion, from fundamentalist to communist, represented in newspapers and satellite channels on television. On the world stage, the state-sponsored violence of Bush and Blair, as many commonsensically predicted, has resulted in increased rather than decreased violence. The world knows, at least as is reported by Europeans in answers to questionnaires, and at least as seen on the streets of London last week, that we live in a much more dangerous place because of the actions of Bush and Blair. As desperate acts become the language of the politically disenfranchised, and the perverse reciprocity of the bombers suffocates alternatives. At home, we are faced with the continual double talk from the administration that things are going along swimmingly as the body count rises. It has become patently clear that all the troops must be withdrawn immediately, yet that only leads us back to the air war mindset. It's okay to bomb others as long as our own aren't bombed or killed. More fundamental political and policy changes are needed then. More needs to be rethought than simply bringing back the troops. For US geopolitical and economic interests remain the determinant. It is no accident that as billions are doled out in corporate reconstruction benefits, the numbers of working poor and the middle class without health insurance in the United States has reached record levels. Yet, this calls for more than dusting off the old jobs not bombs slogan. It means getting beyond the Manichaean mediocrity and the mindset of much of the mass media, both conservative and liberal. There is a tradition and a history of anti-war movements that we should reacquaint ourselves, a tradition to which I think Noam Chomsky belongs, which, in Rosa Luxemburg's words, define being human as throwing oneself on the scales of destiny. One can think of a long list of Americans, from John Brown to Martin Luther King, from Sojourner Truth to Eugene Debs, and Rachel Corrie, who took this as a moral duty. A categorical imperative haunts our present period. The question is, what should be done to stop the process of destruction and dehumanization, in other words, a so-called war against terror, which is presently a permanent global condition? I mention Rachel Corrie not simply as a young person who had decided to join the international solidarity movement and in effect risked her life attempting to protect Palestinian houses from demolition, but also the fact that she was killed by a 60-ton American-made bulldozer. That should give us pause. I mention her, and you can read her letters full of humanity and reciprocity and feeling in the British newspaper The Guardian. I mention her as a representative of a new global consciousness and conscience among American youth. This is not simply a call to action, for the issue here is how to engage the uninformed, to change the epistemological framework of ethnocentrism and narcissism that is most powerfully reproduced in the way the propaganda and media of war touches our lives. As an educational institution involved in communication and the media, it is also a call to plumb the underground of the mind, to reflect critically, clearly, and empathetically, and to connect to the multiple situations out of the primary narcissism of our sequestered college lives. The Columbia University literary scholar and fierce advocate for Palestinian self-determination, Edward Said, who died recently, articulated this in his last essay for the weekly Egyptian paper El Haram. He encouraged us to press for more exacting, a more demanding kind of discussion in which terms are defined from numerous viewpoints and are placed in concrete historical circumstances. Certainly, this demanding, exacting, and clarifying type of discussion is one ongoing goal. It emphasizes critical thinking and intersubjectivity. It emphasizes the other's agency and humanity at home and abroad, and thus it builds on understanding and critical self-reflexivity. It thus also, for those of you and us who work in the media industry, is an ethics which therefore leads to praxis. It is especially fitting that the speaker tonight, who is one of the foremost critics of the media propaganda machine, is speaking at a school which prides itself on excellence and the skill of communication and in the media. Noam Chomsky probably needs no introduction. He is one of a shamefully small group of academics who are critical public intellectuals. He is a polymath, a leader in distinct fields, and he has been an activist against war and for social justice for many decades. He has written and lectured widely on linguistics, philosophy, intellectual history, contemporary issues, international affairs, and US foreign policy. Noam Chomsky has been prolific. His most recent books are Rogue States, 9/11, Understanding Power, On Nature and Language, Pirates and Emperors, Old and New, The Faculty of Language, What Is It, Who Has It, and How Did It Evolve, Chomsky on Democracy and Education, Middle East Illusions, and Hegemony or Survival. This evening, he will speak to us on the topic of propaganda and war, Iraq and Belong. Thank you very much.
Sorry, I'm a little bit late, but you have a very confusing building. If anybody can find room 506 by getting in on 120 Boylston Street, they deserve a PhD for that alone. I didn't, but I was rescued. The title, Iraq and Beyond, makes a good deal of sense. We should be thinking about the future and what we can do to direct it in some favorable course. However, when the word beyond does open a sort of a trap that we should be aware of. And it's particularly striking in the United States. There's a very deep-rooted feature of U.S. intellectual culture that one should be aware of. It's sometimes called the doctrine of change of course. The idea is that in the past, this doctrine is invoked every 2 or 3 years. We've just seen a remarkable invocation of it a few weeks ago, which I'll get back to. The doctrine says, well, yes, in the past we did various unpleasant things out of inadvertence or inattention, but now we're changing course, so we can put all that stale, boring stuff behind us, forget about it, forget the fact that we suppressed or denied it when it was taking place, and march on to a glorious future. The most recent incarnation of the doctrine was a few weeks ago when the president announced a dramatic new change, new course in the U.S. Role in world affairs, in particular in the Middle East. Namely, from now, we realized that in the past we'd supported repressive and brutal regimes and undermined democracy and development, although it was always denied while it was going on. But now we will work to bring democracy to the Middle East. Exciting new development. Greeted with great awe and respect, verging on reverence in the U.S. media, and with ridicule in most of the rest of the world, in particular in the Middle East. Somehow the victims don't find it quite as easy to toss history, including current history, into the ash can, and they pay some attention to it, and we probably should too. It's convenient for those who have the guns. For those who are engaged in ongoing criminal enterprises, it's an extremely convenient doctrine. It's also cowardly and dishonest and very serviceable. Part of one of the services it performs is to make sure that we will understand essentially nothing about what's happening and what's developing and what's going to develop. And in particular, we won't see, as others do, the persistent tendencies that go on with changes of rhetoric and regular decisions to forget everything that came before. And they go on because they are for very elementary reasons. Policies are rooted in institutions. There's some variation, but if the institutions are stable, the policies don't change very much. It's been true for a long time. The institutions are stable, and we can therefore expect much of the same in the future. If it changes dramatically as proclaimed, that'll be wonderful, and everyone will cheer, but nobody's expecting it, at least nobody who isn't writing editorials and commentaries in the U.S. press. And there are good reasons for it, especially in the Middle East, in Latin America, and elsewhere. I'll come back to them if there's time. Well, as you know, and this was just pointed out, the last couple of days, the president was in London. It was quite a remarkable event, in fact, historically without any precedent. I don't think there's been a time when, there have been times when U.S. presidents were greeted with protests and demonstrations, say in Latin America or other places, victimized by a century of U.S. brutality, which we are supposed to forget. But it's never happened before in an allied country, in fact, in the sole allied country. The mayor of London greeted the president, as you probably read, by describing him as the greatest threat to life on this planet that we've most probably ever seen. One of the leaders of the huge protest marches that took place said that no visitor to England has ever been so unwelcome since William the Conqueror. and many others expressed similar sentiments, all quite without precedent. And whatever you think about the sentiments, any sane person who cares about the fate of the world will pay attention to them, won't ignore them. In fact, they're not so new. About a year ago, we were hearing the same thing, maybe not quite as strident, but similar. This began, you can see the real change, in September 2002, when quite a few important things happened. One thing that happened was that the Bush administration announced its national security strategy, declaring quite brazenly and simply that it intended to dominate the world by force permanently and would not tolerate any challenge to that domination. The doctrine has precedents, but it had never been expressed in this fashion before, and it aroused many shudders around the world. Simultaneously, the administration effectively announced that it was going to invade Iraq without credible pretext and without international authorization. And within a couple of weeks, in fact, by October of last year, the mainstream press here was pointing out unhappily that in much of the world there's greater fear of the United States than there is of Saddam Hussein. Actually, that was an understatement. In the rest of the world, Saddam Hussein was despised and reviled, and there are plenty of people who'd be happy to see him torn limb from limb, but he didn't inspire any fear outside the United States. The U.S. was off the international spectrum in this respect. That's true even in the countries that Saddam Hussein had invaded, Kuwait and Iran, the neighboring countries that he'd invaded, and with devastating consequences. Of course, he was hated. They'd be happy to see him, I say, torn to shreds, but they didn't fear him. In fact, for years, they had been trying to reintegrate Iraq back into their regional system over strong U.S. objections. And the reason they didn't fear him is very simple. They knew perfectly well, just as Washington knew, and journalists and commentators knew, that Iraq was the weakest country in the region. It had, as you just heard, been devastated by 10 years of sanctions, which had a horrendous effect on the population, probably killed hundreds of thousands of people, left the society in shreds, strengthened the tyrant, forced the population to become more dependent on him. The country was also essentially disarmed. The United States would never have attacked it if that hadn't been the case. And it was maybe a horrible place internally, but no threat to anyone. That was well understood. It was only in the United States that Iraq was considered a threat, and that happened very quickly. It happened after the massive government media propaganda campaign that began in September 2002. Within a few weeks, a majority of Americans thought that Iraq was a serious threat to the security of the United States. Majority believed that Iraq was developing weapons of mass destruction, that it was responsible for 9/11, that it was planning new atrocities. Those beliefs were held nowhere in the world. They're still held, interestingly. The most recent polls show about 70% still believe that Iraq was pursuing programs of weapons of mass destruction, even though the evidence is overwhelming that that hadn't been true for years, since the U.S. had been supporting them back in the 80s, and that Iraq is tied up with terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda. Those are major achievements of propaganda, and they do distinguish the United States from the rest of the world dramatically since last September. However, these attitudes that you're now hearing on the streets of London were already being expressed a year earlier, shortly after the national security strategy was announced and the war was declared. There was a European Union poll a couple of weeks ago, also just mentioned, which found that people ranked the United States, North Korea, in Iran at the same level as threats to peace, the highest ranking as threats to peace in the world. Actually, not quite the highest ranking. Right above them was Israel. But I suspect that that's a result of the fact that the question was not properly asked. You have to be rather careful with polls because people are not always answering the question that was asked. Israel alone is no threat to peace, but Israel with U.S. support is an enormous threat to peace. Even the U.S. Strategic Command recognizes that. And I suspect that what people were answering, the question they were answering was when they were asked what's the greatest threat to peace, is U.S.-backed Israeli policies, which are inflaming the region and regarded as extremely dangerous elsewhere, and right below that, the United States itself. If that's in fact what they were answering, which I think is likely, then they probably are recognizing something that is also pretty well understood outside the United States. It was just articulated by one of the most astute contemporary historians who deals with the contemporary Middle East, Dilip Hero, in a forthcoming book, who points out that what actually happened in Iraq, I'm quoting him, what actually happened in Iraq is something deadlier than the worst scenarios sketched by the pessimists. The invasion of Iraq has led to an alliance of Arab nationalism with Islamic militancy, steering both towards a very ominous amalgam in the region and the world. And in fact, you're seeing it in the headlines day after day around the region, and it's expected to extend to the world. And it's also understood that another factor in creating that deadly amalgam is U.S. support for Israeli policies of undermining the possibility for a political settlement of the Israel-Arab conflict by carrying out development programs within the occupied territories that effectively make it impossible for any political settlement to eventuate, a matter of great concern throughout the world outside the United States and backed by the United States. And furthermore, these are policies that have been going on for 30 years, but we're supposed to forget all that under the doctrine of change of course, even though it continues today. Well, facts are stubborn little things, and they're easy for the rich and powerful to forget, but not so easy for the people at the wrong ends of the guns to forget, and they respond. And if we want to understand the world, we should pay some attention to that. With regard to Iraq itself, it was predicted by Western intelligence agencies and independent specialists almost universally that the invasion of Iraq would very likely lead to an increase in terror and proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. The reasons for that are quite simple. Didn't take a genius to figure them out. When you announce publicly that you're going to attack anyone you feel like and destroy them if they're defenseless, they're not going to react by saying, thank you, here's my throat, please cut it. What they'll do is figure out some way to defend themselves. And while no one can begin to compete with the United States at the level of armaments, the U.S. spends approximately as much as the rest of the world combined and is technologically far more advanced, there are weapons which are available to the weak, too. Terror and weapons of mass destruction. They happen to be available to the weak. So it's to be expected that they will proliferate, both of them, as a result of the invasion, and that's exactly what's happened. There's been further proliferation, and as expected, and you just have to read the papers every day to see that there's an explosion of terror everywhere, probably linked in some loose way to the Al-Qaeda network, but a reflection of exactly what was predicted.